Nice to be here. Jane, thanks for the invitation, for the greeting. And so the protocol is I'll give a talk and then at 2:30 we'll meet and chat, right? I don't have to speak until 2:30.
You do not.
Okay.
The seminar will end between 1:20 and 1:30.
Good, okay, very good. So yeah, very nice to be here. Nice to meet you all. Looking forward to chatting later. So I have to have a confession. I'm not sure what One Health is. I always think, what is that exactly? But I think it's the intersection between human and environmental health. And we certainly work on that in our lab. And today I'll talk about sort of issues of food sustainability and whatnot, but I also thought I'd quickly touch base on the other things that we do in the lab. Again, the intersection of environmental and human health. We work a lot in the Arctic, the fastest rate of temperature increases on the planet. 4 to 6 degrees, there's Colin Bonner here, carrying sod from lower elevation to higher elevation, testing climate impacts in the Arctic on plants. But we also work in Scandinavia where we look at how Sami reindeer herders are affected by vegetation change. There's all sorts of unexpected things that can happen with climate. So reindeer and probably caribou in Canada as well. During the summer they like to sit on snowpacks to avoid flies, especially botfly. The snowpacks disappear, they run until they die practically from stress from the insects. Snowpacks are melting in the Arctic. So there's these unanticipated ways that climate change is affecting humanity, both Arctic and here as well. So we do some Arctic work. We work on rangelands. Here's Ollie Carroll here on the far right. He works on a range of things in the lab, but on this as well. So global rangelands, right? So 70% of all agriculture is rangeland based. Animal protein is huge to our diet. Rangelands are changing quickly, actually. So rangelands are grasslands, right? They're in a tension zone between forest and desert. Too wet, they're forest. Too dry, they're desert. So they're always in a balance between too wet and too cold, so they're highly sensitive to climate. They're like a canary in the coal mine. And we're looking at a global study on various changes to rangelands as well. So we do a range of things in the lab, rangelands included. But again, today primarily I'm going to talk about agriculture. So we've started working on this issue in the lab in about 2013, but it really kicked off with the Food from Thought initiative through CEFRAF, the Aero Food Institute, and so forth. And a number of us, including Kevin McCann in his lab is here today, John Frixell in his lab, there's a range of us who've been involved in this, going back for in this case till 2016. And our basic question is food sustainability, and especially on environmental impacts. So that's what I want to discuss today mostly. And I want to emphasize this is a collaborative effort. I apologize to the lab. I found as many photos as I could, as quickly as I could. So this is lab-based research. It's also, again, collaborative-based. So Kevin McCann and their group and so forth. Bob Hanner's here. And anyway, so there's a range of us that are working on this collectively. So, and I'll talk about that as we go on. Ali Dolezal's research is really big. She's in here a few places too for her insect work and so forth. Okay. So human health and agriculture, it'd be wrong to not recognize that conventional agriculture has been a miracle, right? The amount of food we produce now since the 1930s in particular is unbelievable in human history, right? So I think the average per capita amount of food available in 1961 was half of what it is today. We can produce a phenomenal amount of food. You know, malnutrition in places like sub-Saharan Africa is more about distribution than it is production. You know, there is local land issues there, but so we've been phenomenally successful, but as we all know, the impacts are starting to build, right? So 15 to 25% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture. Canada likes to boast we're only 8%, but that's relative, unfortunately, because our fossil fuel greenhouse gas emissions are so massive. They relatively dwarf agriculture compared to other places. But generally speaking, greenhouse gas emissions are large and growing, especially for nitrous oxide. So there's that. Oh boy, it's an endless array of impacts, right? Nitrogen, in the Mississippi watershed, I think they estimate 20 to 30% of all nitrogen annually can wash down into the Gulf of Mexico, creating these hypoxic dead zones. Kevin McCann's group works on that, so there's the Frixell lab. What else? Well, food waste is a massive inefficiency. If we cut down on food waste, we reduce environmental impacts of agriculture probably by 15%, because we have to grow less food because I don't know what the numbers are. A lot of you may know better than me. It's 15 to 25 to 50% of food waste. It varies. That's an inefficiency. And then, of course, there's biodiversity. So the UN Environmental Program, I think they estimate that 86% of all the species at risk on the planet, at risk of extinction, 24,000 out of 28,000 are directly attributable to agriculture. So there's a laundry list of impacts that are starting to add up. Okay, and so we need to acknowledge those impacts while also recognizing If we hit 10 billion by 2050, our food needs may double. So how are we going to reconcile that? It's one of the greatest challenges facing humankind, actually. There's a number of them, but that's a big one, is what we're going to do there. So again, a lot of us with Food from Thought, a lot of us in this space are trying to tackle that issue. And we certainly are putting our foot into that water. So one of the biggest advancements is, pretty straightforward thinking. It's about precision agriculture. We tend to treat landscapes as homogeneous units in agriculture. And if the land's really bad, we fertilize to overcome that and so forth. The idea behind precision ag, regenerative agriculture, however you guys want to define those terms, is recognizing that there's environmental heterogeneity, paying attention to it, and trying to maximize your crop yields in the best places, and then try to deal with the places that never should have been farmed in the first place. That's lands, what we call marginal lands, right? Poorly drained, rapidly drained, infertile, whatever it might be, heavily sloped. So we have farmed a lot of land that never should be farmed, and so one of the great hopes of regenerative or precision ag is we find a balance. So this figure portrays what we call ecosystem services. Those are services generated from biological diversity of benefit to humankind, right? So in a natural ecosystem, you can see these various carbon sequestration and water flow regulation and so forth. The petals on the flower, you can see natural systems largely provide every service except crop production. On the flip, monoculture provides one real service, that's crops. The dream with regenerative ag at the far right, or whatever we want to call it, is there's a balance where we're growing food and creating services to have a happy medium and eliminate all of our problems. That's the dream. Problem is, and it's a big dream, right? So Canada's a carbon plan for 2050 where we want to be carbon net neutral, right? So our outputs are matched by our inputs. Most major corporations on the planet have that same sustainability objective for net neutrality. A lot of it comes from offsetting, right? Carbon offsetting. That's where plants grow. They eat carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. They drop it below ground in root matter and the carbon stores. That's the dream, right? So it's big, like carbon offsetting. Anyways, there's a lot of stories on that, which we'll get into a little bit. So it's the big hope. But the big problem is there's very little science suggesting it's going to work. So one of the ideas of, one of the hopes behind restoring land, marginal land, and agricultural system is that you'll have habitat for insect diversity. But one question is, and Ali Dolezal in our lab works on this, if the insect apocalypse, as the New York Times says, is truly here, you can build it in, that Field of Dreams movie where build it and they will come. Well, nothing may show up if there's nothing left to show up, right? And the scale of things such as nitrogen pollution and algal blooms and such, phosphorus pollution is so huge that what can a little bit of marginal land do to overcome that, right? So there are a lot of questions. So there's a lot of hope, but a lot of questions. And so there's been, the United States alone has created 36 million acres of marginal land retirement. But the hope is that it creates services, but it's rarely measured, right? And we talk about ecosystem service markets. There has to be some sort of a validation, some sort of a natural capital benchmarking to occur to actually show what we're getting out of what we're creating. That's generally been deficient. It's one of the greatest weaknesses in a lot of these carbon offsetting programs or ecosystem service markets in general is actually counting what's being accumulated. That's where the science comes in, and that's what we try to do, right? So yeah, so that's the big objective in our lab, amongst the other things that I mentioned, is trying to figure out how land retirement works in an ecological sense. Fortunately, every single service provided by retired land is biological or ecological, right? It's biological activity sequestering carbon. It's biological activity capturing nutrients flowing off from fields. It's it's biodiversity impacting the environment, and of course the environment impacts the biodiversity, right? You build habitat and things show up. There's a reciprocal relationship that we all deal with in ecology. There's a lot of mechanistic theory on that. We use that to try and figure out how the marginal lands work, and then we test that in the field. If that makes sense, right? So we're trying to harness these biological processes that we know well about in ecology to try and see how much of this service provision is actually going to occur in these retired lands. So that's what we do. Okay, so how do we do that? Where do we do it? We do it in Southern Ontario for now, at least. We work with ALICE Canada. It's increasingly more people have heard of ALICE. It's alternative land use and sustainability, I always forget. But it's a farmers-led initiative, right? So it's one thing to talk about farm sustainability, From a government perspective or from an academic perspective, it's a whole other thing to actually have farmers doing the work because they're at the front line. So Alice was started in, I think, around 2010 by Brian Gilvasey and Dave Reed down in Norfolk County in the Lake Erie shoreline, and their dream was, so Dave was a hunter, he wanted to reintroduce Bob White to Ontario. Brian was interested in, he produces the food in the woolly, Borealis, and Majida, or however you pronounce it. He produces all the food there. He grows Texas Longhorn cattle on tallgrass prairie that's organic and zero input and all this sort of stuff. So they were already interested in alternative land management on farms. They started the program. It's now Canada's fastest growing farmer-led environmental sustainability initiative. So they're already retiring land on their own. They don't get any government money. They have money from corporations that support their work to retire land to try and increase ecosystem services to try and reduce farm impact. So they had already created the research template, if you will, and then Brian talked to Karen Landman over in landscape architecture, whatever you call it now. And then she called me and said, "Are you guys interested?" And we said, "Yeah, we are." So that's how it started. So we work with farmers. This is a farm in Norfolk County. It's here's the cornfield. Here's a retired grassland they've put in permanent cover tallgrass prairie. You can see a close-up shot there, corn on the right. So they put small parts of their land, the most marginal, bad land, they put it in permanent cover prairie. This is down slope. There's wetland complex here by this remnant forest. The water from the crop fields, they're about ratios of 50 to 60 to 100 to 1. So the crop fields are massive relative to the prairie, but all the water off those fields flows through the prairie. The goal is nutrient retention and so forth, carbon storage. That's a typical Alice farm. I think they've retired somewhere in the order of 40,000 acres nationally now, and there's more farmers that want to participate than Alice has resources to support them. So again, it's been a huge success. So we, like I said, we started doing work in 2013. It really took off in 2016. Alice started in 2017? Yes. 2017, and she and another student, Annalisa Mazzarato, helped build what really is a research platform of 24 farms at that time, looking at, here's a typical farm. This is from your thesis, I think. So crop field, retired prairie, and woodland, looking at how those cover types influence, in Ali's case, insects, but also we looked at soil carbon, we've looked at nutrient capture, and then we've looked at how the insect food web supports birds and bats, and then Kevin's group has looked at fish and so on and so forth. So we're looking at trophic connections, biological responses to habitat creation, and so forth. So yeah, it's a multi-farm research platform, and we focus on these three pillars: clean air, clean water, and biodiversity. That's an Alice thing. They like to talk in simple language, which sometimes academics struggle with. We use our big terms. But though clean air, clean water, and biodiversity, everybody gets. And our work all centers on those three factors. And so yeah, we're doing a range of things. We are Matt Pavus in our labs looking at benthic aquatic invertebrates in restored Alice wetlands, what the limiting factors are there, nutrient pollution and pesticides and so forth. Lake Ellsworth started in our lab and is looking at bats. So we have bat detectors, the sonic sensors that can pick up bat calls at night. There's 8 species of bat in Ontario, 3 are nationally endangered. Every single one of them, all 8, are on every one of the Alice farms. And we've put these bat sensors by habitat type, and most of the bats are over the crop fields, which was exactly opposite of what we thought. So now Lake's research is going to be focusing on whether or not there's meaningful biological control by the bats, because it looks like there might be. And then Annika Wilcox has just started in the lab, and she's looking at bird responses in wetlands as well. So these are the biodiversity responses, and again, we also look at things like soil carbon and nutrients. So we're doing all this simultaneously. Our group is, and again, there's others involved. So what I want to talk about first is, well, 2 things in the rest of the talk. I want to talk about some of the findings that we've started to see. Again, the question is, can these marginal lands meaningfully work? Can they contribute to any sort of biodiversity restoration? Can they meaningfully capture soil carbon, whatever it might be? So we want to figure out if they work. The second thing is we want to figure out what potential they may have to provide the farmers with some sort of economic incentive, right? And that's the tough nut to crack. If payment for ecosystem services is going to work, they've got to have some value somewhere within the market, or they'll never be able to compete with things like wheat production and so forth, right? So there's two things I want to talk about in for the remainder of my time. Any questions or comments? I know this is a class setting. Sometimes good to break things up a bit. But yeah, Bob?
I'm just wondering with the bats over the ag fields, is it just purely a scale effect? That the prairie areas are so small that they are foraging, or can you actually disentangle that kind of scale effect?
Well, it's a good question. It could be, because that's one of the findings we're going to have is no matter how much restoration happens, it's still 5 to 10% of farm footprint, 90% is still field. So it very much could be that they're, we have the listening devices over the wetlands, over the prairie, and the forest, and over the crop field, and the crop field's picking out everything. So it seems like maybe they're gravitating there. We actually thought that they may be preferentially targeting the little wetlands, because you do get a lot of insect blooms there, whatever you call them. So we don't know. It could be the case that that's happening. So one of the things Lake's going to be doing is seeking out bat colonies. He's also putting up bat boxes to see if we can get scat, so we can do barcoding to see if we can pick out diet. And then Kevin's group with Marie and others have actually done malaise trapping on these same sites. And so we know what insects tend to emerge when and where they are. And then we can match that up with the bats, hopefully, and see. Like the dream would be their tummies are full of like soybean aphid. That would be sort of the ultimate dream, and we're not sure we can get to that level of precision, but that's what we're after. But it is true, the footprint of these things is still relatively small. So yeah.
Just in addition, it's interesting because like Marie did some work on, this is just moving the field just for a second here, on cage cultures. And there, what we found was like lake trout and cisco have the feed from the cage cultures in their stomach. So they're being attracted to the agriculture in a sense, which may be what's happening here with the bats too.
Well, I think some of the birds respond the same. Some of these at-risk birds, actually, the waste corn in the fall is huge as part of their annual, like getting through the winter. Yeah. So there can be subsidies or whatever. Yeah, something. Basically a bird feeder effect. Yeah. So that'll be one cool thing to see with the not only the. So Ali's shown there's lots of insects on these farms, more than we might have thought. But also the abundances there might be peaks, resource waves or whatever that you guys talk about that help subsidize some of these populations, absolutely. I mean, and that's another message here is it's not all agricultural doom and gloom. So we do actually find substantive populations of insects in these areas. As I said, we see every single bat species in Ontario on all these farms. So it's not as catastrophic as I might have even thought based on reading the newspaper when I started this. But that's also part of the science, is to figure out where exactly are we good and bad. Where's the true ground versus the ground you might get to if you read the newspaper too much. So, all right. So that's a quick any other questions? I don't mind the interruption at all. So, moment of silence for the Blue Jays, Pete. Okay. Okay. So what did we find here? So again, it's great to retire land. It's great to put in permanent cover areas. But does it actually do anything, right? So the idea is the bad land, if you will, the marginal land, has the lowest yields anyways, because the soil is somehow limited. It needs the most inputs of fertilizer and or irrigation to overcome the limitations. Therefore, it's the most expensive to farm. Therefore, the impacts are the highest because you're adding the most, say, for example, nitrogen fertilizer. So it's kind of a lose-lose-lose all the way around. So it makes sense to retire land. But does it produce the three sort of service pillars that we've talked about? Greenhouse gas retention by carbon storage. Does it capture nutrients flowing off of farm fields and so forth? And so we've done, like I said, almost a decade of work on this now, and the answer is very much yes. And another factor is it's probably obvious, but we didn't know this that when we started, is that time really matters. So there's a couple things to untangle here. First, so this is time in years since the prairie was created, and created from a crop field, so it's 100% conversion. So instantly, as soon as you stop growing crops, insects show up, right? The prairie takes 3 to 5, so this is tallgrass prairie, it's native to Ontario. European settlement, there was probably 1 to 2,000 square kilometers of prairie in Ontario, more than we ever realized. And it was almost instantly eliminated because it was the easiest land to clear. So the farmers are planting tallgrass prairie, so it's all native species. Just by stopping putting corn and soybeans in, you start to get ground nesting bees. So you get weedy plants that come in really quickly. They eventually die out. They serve as habitat for beneficial insects and so forth. So you get really immediate effects of insects. As I said, it takes 3 to 5 years for the root networks to build in these prairies. When the root networks build, and I'll show you a photo later, they're substantive and they're really effective filtering of nutrient-laden water flowing through the prairie. So your nutrient retention starts to build over time slowly. And then finally, carbon storage. So carbon storage, again, is the greatest hope of all. Farming carbon is something we've been talking about for at least 10 years, if not longer, and the hope is permanent cover instantly leads to carbon. The answer is it doesn't. Any soil ecologist would have known this, could have told you this, but we looked at it as well and we found really slow accumulation. But it does accumulate, but it's more decadal than instant, right? So it's kind of like the compound interest building in your bank account, especially when interest rates are painfully slow, as they have been. You get a slow accumulation, but you do get an accumulation through time. So this is kind of cool, I suppose. Time really matters. It's a huge problem for farmers. No farmer wants to lock up their land indefinitely. A lot of contracts with Alice are 5 to 10 years max. Farmers are allowed to clear their prairie anytime they want. They almost never do, but they're always in control because that's what farmers want. Conservation Reserve Program in the United States, that's the biggest, most successful land retirement program in North America. Same thing, 10-year contracts. So farmers don't want to be locked in. Canada's new carbon plan, it's got 3 natural, what do they call it, natural, I think, restoration objectives. One, they want to plant 2 billion trees. You guys may have heard of this. The second is to protect carbon-rich ecosystems like boreal wetlands. That's great. The third is land management. And the hope is land management favoring agricultural systems in particular. Generally speaking, the government of Canada is favoring 100 years plus guarantees. No farmer's going to do that ever. So that creates an immediate problem. So this time matters is cool ecologically, but economically it's an impediment. And so Alice is working directly with the federal government saying, hey, hang on a sec. Like, can you guys soften your rules or try to, land autonomy for farmers is huge, as you can probably anticipate or already know. So the time one is cool, but it reveals that the plan isn't going to be as simple as we thought. Carbon accumulation isn't instant. We need to start thinking about long-term strategies in agricultural systems. So that's one of the ecosystem services messages that we've gotten through looking at details such as this. So yeah, so soil carbon, the idea of soil carbon again is plants eat carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, convert it to structural material, deposit it below ground. The microbial community, of course, is trying to break down that soil matter, that below ground matter, as quickly as possible, and it respires carbon back to the atmosphere. So it's a withdrawal, deposit, tension zone that's continually happening. Permanent cover slows down the microbial respiration, so your deposits exceed your withdrawals. So here's a study. Actually, I did this with folks at the University of Minnesota at Cedar Creek, but the sand plains here in Minnesota are almost identical to Norfolk County. So we see after 30 years, these various colors are levels of nutrient enrichment. Interestingly enough, the most nutrient-rich soils produce the most carbon, and it peaked after 30 years. So here you start to see slow incremental increases after a decade. By 30 years, you're starting to hit saturation point. So again, this confirms it can happen, carbon storage, but it's longer term. And again, this is the engine that drives carbon accumulation in prairie. Prairie's like an iceberg. You can see the grasses above ground, but most of the activity is below ground. This is what do they call this, a diorama from a museum in the Midwest, where you can see the root network below. And we did the same thing. We didn't create the diorama, but we did the same thing on our farms, looking at root matter in spring under restored prairie in the top soil layer, 0 to 60 centimeters. Like, there's no crop roots that are retained in the soil over winter into the spring, and then below 60 centimeters, you can kind of see the same thing. And this is woodland as well. It's another little element of a lot of Alice farms, a lot of Ontario farms have back 40 woodlots that turn out to be really great places for carbon storage because they haven't been cultivated in decades, right? So this is the engine that drives carbon accumulation. So it can happen, it just takes a long time. All right, so that's one quick bullet, if you will. The second is time is really important, and so is the amount of habitat you protect. And first and foremost, this is almost an instantaneous thing, as I mentioned with the insects. It also doesn't really matter how much habitat you have. Just creating it is important because, as it turns out, this is from Amy Newman's lab. Oh boy, Bryn Varco's the master student doing this work, looking at a bunch of farms with and without Alice Prairie. Doesn't matter what the size and shape and duration of the prairie is. If you've got it there, it almost doubles bird diversity, right? So as with insects, so with the birds, things show up really quickly and things are habitat starved. So one of the cool findings here is that, again, with an insect apocalypse, or grassland birds are the fastest declining group of birds on the planet after maybe insect-eating birds. If you build habitat, they do show up in this case. right? So they still are on the landscape. We've seen this work with native pollinators, where we build prairie and we have a doubling of pollinator diversity and a tripling of pollinator abundance within 3 years. And then my question is, well, where the heck are these things in the landscape when there isn't prairie? And we looked at that, and they're mostly in roadside ditches, right? So Ryan Norris's group in the department has looked at monarch butterflies and how important little ditches are along the migratory route all the way down through Kansas to Mexico, where the milkweed can actually hang on. We're seeing the same thing in Ontario. So they're hanging on in the landscape, which is good news. You build habitat, they show up in large numbers. That's great news, right? So just having habitat was really important. And then, as with time, so with size, right? The bigger the prairie, the more things you accumulate. This is took some of Ali's data on insects, insect taxa per unit area. So the farms that she had prairie sizes from big to small, and you see you get bigger areas have more insects, as you might expect. But same with soil organic carbon. So this is just a scaling issue, similar to what Bob asked there. You have more land, you have more carbon. You know, the per unit area thing is important. So just by having larger prairies, you have more stored carbon on the farm. So area does matter there as well, as you might expect. That's basic conservation biology. Bigger parks are better. But even if you can't have bigger parks, we are finding that these things can punch above their weight. That even small amounts of prairie, just anything where a bird or an insect can hang out, they're hanging out. Okay? A third one is the farmer really matters. This is not a great graph, actually, because there's a lot going on, but I'll quickly walk you through it. What the farmer does really, really matters, right? And so the big thing here, so we're looking at drivers of soil organic carbon accumulation among 24 farms. This histogram here shows the relative explanatory power of various factors. Farm identity stands out. It's almost double anything else. Sand versus silt. Right, sand plays a big role in carbon storage and so forth, but the farm matters more than anything else. This graph here shows the ranking of farm by soil organic carbon from a little to a lot. You can see there's quite a difference. Phosphorus. So these farms are broadly identical. They're all corn, soy, and wheat. This farm has got almost 110 units of phosphorus per soil. This one's almost got none. Identical farm. So that's the farmer making different decisions on when they add phosphorus, nitrate the same. So farm management and farm legacy in the past are both shaping what we see, right? Now phosphorus is an interesting one because it's kind of sticky. It can stick around for decades when you add it. So it takes a long time for phosphorus to wash out of the soil. Hey, if you look at Norfolk and Elgin County, it's tobacco country, right? I don't smoke, but whenever I drive by a tobacco field, it's like, what a beautiful plant. I kind of want to smoke. They're gorgeous plants. They're aromatic. And there's still considerable tobacco production there. The tobacco quota system was eliminated in the early 2000s. A lot of farmers took the buyout, but some didn't. So this is tobacco country. Tobacco is incredibly hungry for phosphorus. So Norfolk and Elgin counties are super interesting because they're sand plains for the most part, like the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl in the United States. So with that part of North Lake Erie shoreline to the north, massive soil erosion in the 1920s and 30s. Huge legacies of environmental destruction, of deforestation. I talk about this in my conservation biology class. Have anyone gone on the south elevator on campus on the 3rd floor? There's that picture of the University of Guelph campus from like 1910. There's 2 little patches of woods, one where the Freeman's maples are and the other at the corner of Victoria and College. And that was it. And that was Ontario. Ontario was largely deforested in the late 1700s, 1800s. And this is some of the environmental destruction that happened. So what's the fine arts building called? The Zavitz building or something? Wasn't he he's the father of Ontario forests. I think that's why they named the building. Is that right, Pete? You're nodding your head? Yeah, and that he developed a program. He planted billions of trees in Ontario. In fact, is it the St. William's Nursery? Oh, there's a nursery down in this part of the country where they built it on this site in the 1930s to start growing billions of trees. Right? So there's massive deforestation. So that past legacy also shapes what we see on farms today. Phosphorus derives from tobacco production, and then the longer term, the historical destruction as well. Again, it's a miracle there's any bees or birds left on this landscape, given how badly it was destroyed. So nature has some resiliency. But again, one of the lessons that we've seen is you got to look to the past to start to understand why things look the way they look today. All right, and then the last thing is a point that Bob anticipated. So these prairie areas, these restored areas, do have some capacity to increase ecosystem services on the farm. Habitat for biodiversity, some level of carbon storage. We've also seen they're very effective at capturing subsurface water within the top 40 centimeters that flow through from the cornfields into the prairie. The the phosphorus and nitrogen is taken up really quickly by prairie plants. Groundwater, not so much. In the winter, not so much because nothing is growing. The snow melt pulses of nitrogen and phosphorus can be really big, which gets to a question on design on these things. So they work, but they're not sufficient on their own. So as we move forward, another big lesson with regenerative farming, precision farming, and retirement is it can't do it all on its own, especially given the small spatial footprint. So here's an illustration. So this is back to the soil organic carbon study that we did looking at various cover types, farm woodlot, the retired prairie, and crop fields. And this is soil organic carbon by volume, and the amount of carbon stored in a single shared volume unit. The woodlots, because they haven't been cultivated in decades, had the highest carbon pound per pound of the three cover types. That's by volume unit. If you look by total area, crop fields are 90% of the farm, even though they have less carbon per unit area. That at the farm level, that's still where most of the activity is happening. So if we're going to manage farm level carbon, we've got to pay attention to the crop fields. We can't just retire. It's not enough, right? And it may seem obvious, but we had to go through this process to start to measure what the pools and flows of things such as carbon to start to see this sort of a thing. Same with the capture of nutrients. So this arrow shows the flow off of these. In this case, it was a cornfield into that retired prairie. The bigger the prairie, the better. It was fine, but you're still getting pulses of nutrients. At least you can see the details here is just to show this is through time, the pulses of nutrients in the cornfields and the prairie. You're still getting the prairie overwhelmed at times by the volume of the flow and the concentration of the nutrients. So it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. It has to be a partnership, right? So that's one thing. That's one major lesson that happened. So we got, bigger retired areas were better, ones that retired for longer help, and so forth. But it's necessary, not sufficient. There has to be a whole farm model. And I don't think anyone who follows regenerative agriculture would disagree with that at all. So we have to pay attention to on the farm field as well as beside it. That's one major message. The second one is whatever role retirement is going to play, it's not going to matter if the land is cultivated back. And this dynamic is, many of you may be aware, maybe not, about intensification versus extensification. So intensification is using a lot of nutrients to grow get high yields in relatively small areas. That's intensification. That's modern agriculture, right? It's been massively successful. Extensification is when you put in less inputs, but you grow food over a large area to make up for the lost yield, right? So one is yield through nitrogen and so forth. The second is yield through area, sheer volume. So, hey, look at nitrogen fertilizer costs. Nitrogen manufacturing developed in World War I for bombs. It turned out to be a great way to grow plants as well. It's super expensive, super energy intensive, demands fossil fuels. That's why Russia is one of the world leaders in nitrogen production. New Brunswick farmers bought all their fertilizer, nitrogen, from Russia, and actually couldn't fertilize their potatoes at first this year because of the war, the many implications of the Russian-Ukrainian war. And look what happened to nitrogen prices in 2021 versus 2019, 2020. So we've got exploding nitrogen / fossil fuel costs. That's going to shift things away from intensification to extensification. It's going to put increasing pressure on land. As many of you may be aware or not, phosphorus is a non-renewable resource, right? Nitrogen and phosphorus, the two most major nutrients for plant growth. Phosphorus is not a renewable resource. We've mined all the islands for guano. We've mined all the bison bones off of the prairies, which is why we collect. That's why Regina, pile of bones, they collected those bones for phosphorus fertilizer. Well, that's gone. There was actually a colonial war over a guano island off the coast of South America because phosphorus was so important. Those so-called biological bases of phosphorus are gone. We're now down to mining it, right? And so the estimates of peak phosphorus all over the map. The best high-quality phosphorus is what we certainly are going to run out maybe the 2030s, 2040s. And the remainder is going to be sub-quality, and it's really environmentally destructive to extract. So Nitrogen's going to get more expensive. Phosphorus is going to get expensive. The dream of having sort of a farm matrix of retired habitat and crops is going to be put under a ton of pressure. So this is maybe the biggest thing of all with land retirement. If it's going to serve any function at all, it's going to have to stick around. And that's one of the biggest challenges, and that's where payment for ecosystem services come in. And it's going to be vast. So I show this photo to show how broadly the implications of these sort of intensification, extensification things can work. So I mentioned about the University Gulf landscape. Anyone here go to Pine River Provincial Park? Probably everybody. Whether you go to Grand Bend on the 2-4 weekend or whatever it may be. This is an air photo of Pine River Park from the 1950s. You can see how open it is. Pine River Park now is substantively closed in, right? You can see up top there, you can see how open it is in Pine River Park, and those are guys planting trees in the 1960s. Got this photo from Zev Gedeloff in geography. So Ontario used to be vastly more open because we cleared it. Ontario became vastly more forested because of intensification. We didn't need to farm all the land that we've cleared. So these sorts of pressures have massive impacts on global landscapes, right? So Eastern North America is reforested by, I think, 75% since World War II. So that's intensification, concentrating plant growth in a small area. If we go to extensification, even parks, depending on how food limited we become, the pressure on anything that's forested is going to be extreme. Right? The United Nations have already called attention to that this year with the Russian-Ukrainian war and already food shortages and fuel costs. So this is a pressure that's going to face, well, I'm old enough, I'll probably escape it, but you younger people, you've inherited our mess, I'm afraid. So, okay. So retirement can work, but there's going to be pressure. So if it's going to stick around, retirement has to pay its own way. Retired lands has to provide some revenue stream to farmers, or it's just not going to work, right? The pressures to put it back into corn from, say, retired wetland are going to be massive. So how can that happen? So we've looked at the economics of land marginalities. We're not economists, so it's always a fool's endeavor to try and say, for example, demonstrate if farmers make money when you don't know anything about, I can barely manage my own household income. But we attempt it anyways, and the punchline here is, as you may know, farming is a really difficult profession to make a living in. And so the opportunities for ecosystem services and stable protection of marginal lands is actually the fact that crop farming is so variable, so unstable. So if you provide revenue streams that are in any way stable, even if it's relatively low, that's going to be attractive to farmers. That's the best hope. So let me walk through some of the figures we produced to show that where that conclusion comes from. This is work done by Ellen Ish, who was a postdoc in our lab. So Canada's got some of the best farm data in the world going back to 1926. Statistics Canada website's rich with this sort of stuff, and so it allows us to calculate, for example, a graph such as this. This is input cost of farming since 1926. It's not exponential increase, but it's a steady, large increase. Farming is getting more and more expensive, right? So this is the sweat of the farmer's brow in 1926. This is industrialization, the green revolution to today. So farming already is getting super expensive. It's been kind of fun to sort of tease apart. Like this graph, you can do a lecture on it just on this. So for example, in 1930, every farm in Ontario had livestock, oxen and horses. 25% of all grains grown in 1930 went to feeding the livestock. So it was hugely inefficient to have livestock. So having mechanization freed up all that extra production, and there's all sorts of stories like this. Soybean didn't really kick in until the 1970s. The 1972 oil crisis drove change, and anyways, on and on. But the main thing about this is input costs have gone through the roof. Right? It's more and more expensive to farm versus what it used to be. And this is the underlying figure that explains that. Here's purple's fertilizer and lime use. You can see it's all from 1926 onward. Commercial seed production, pesticides, fertilizer, irrigation, and so forth. So farmers pay more and more to grow food, right? Which we all know, that's the green revolution and so forth. That's what it looks like, but this is how we've grown our food, right? So it's interesting to look at that, and then I've left this open graph for you to do in your mind's eye, draw the green line. Where are crop yields? Is it a one-for-one trade-off or something less? I always find this super interesting because I didn't know. I might have thought it would be one-for-one. You can see all that white space there suggests that it isn't. So yields, 2 two and a half times on average. These are for, I think, 25 crops in total. So there's large yield reductions, but there's an inefficiency. An increasing gap between cost and production, right? So right away, that's a problem because you're receiving less output for more effort. So there's an economic inefficiency right away. And this is for Canada, but you see it for the world as well. Here's Africa, Europe, and this green is inputs, the yellow is outputs. There's an increasing gap globally. We're doing more and more and more to produce relatively less. And so that's one of the reasons why farmers have such a hard time making money. And meanwhile, market price, and I'll show you some more detailed figures, market price is on the average less. The value of a grain of corn in 1926 was actually more than it is now. The things such as overproduction, which is another one of the ironies in this, right? It's really hard to hit that perfect line where you match production with need in every industry, including agriculture. Okay, so this is what the farmer is facing. Dropping market prices, huge increase in costs, and a relatively steady but relatively low increase in output. So that's, if you're a business person right away, you can figure out, oh, that's not a way to make money. And of course, sure enough, it isn't. This is from 2020, U.S. farm bankruptcies hit an 8-year high. It's tough to make a living as a farmer. Anyone know the average salary for a farm in Canada? Yep.
Negative.
Well, I think it's 165. I looked at this. Well, okay, so first of all, trying to figure out if farmers make money is impossible. But I think if you look at statistics, I did it last night because I'm never sure. It's at 160,000. But to supporting your point, I mean, this is the thing. I've spent 3 years on this. I still can't tell. Because look at this graph. So this is from 1995 to 2015. These are prices for barley, canola, and so forth year to year. And the key thing here is fluctuation. So look at the graph in the bottom. This is when you lose money if you go below. If you grew green corn in 2014, you were a millionaire because that was ethanol boom, right? If you grew it in 2015, you had to give the Mercedes-Benz you bought back to the bank because it dropped, right? So 25% of the time, farmers are losing money on their crops. So it makes sense to say that they're making negative. Contrast this graph with this one. You can see it's basically slid up. These are government subsidies. Government subsidies, including crop insurance, push the price of grain at least up towards this line. So governments pay to help farmers make money. You know, the COVID crisis in the United States is super interesting because the farmers got more money than they could use with these COVID support programs for food production. So government inputs are huge to growing money. So bankruptcy is up, government support is up. This eventually is moving towards the potential for payment for ecosystem services. So the purple line is the amount of crop area from 1926, and it actually tracks crop production pretty good. It really, since 1970, I believe, the cropland has increased by 30% in Canada. Again, that's natural grasslands plowed under, that's wetlands plowed under, that's forest cleared. So more land, and that's the extensification thing playing out. So as crop costs go up, more and more land is plowed in part to help meet the shortfall, to save money. But what's interesting, again, moving towards our marginal land model, is where have those crop increases come from, the increasing land use? It's largely by our suboptimal and horribly optimal, less optimal lands. Okay, so what's this figure saying? We have 7 classes of soil generally that is used globally, including in Canada. So class 1 it's highly productive, you don't have to do anything to it. From class 3 to class 7, I put those blue boxes there, they're somehow severely limited. Needs water, needs extra cultivation, it needs nutrients, whatever it might be. So from classes 3 to 7, you're talking about severely limited land. This is the change in cropland from 1990 to 2010. We are increasingly growing our food in Canada on bad land. In fact, 30% of all of our crops are on class, we just did it to class 4 to be less contentious. If you include class 3, I think it's close to 50% of our crops are grown on suboptimal land that needs a lot of inputs. Interesting trend here. Here's our best land. We use less of it now than ever. Anyone know why? Pete's not. Oh, yeah. That's where people want to live. So this is another part of the marginal land model. We need to protect marginal lands because they're the worst to grow food in. Our best ones we're putting up Walmarts and where my house is going. And, you know, it's in southern Ontario, of course, it's really bad. St. Catharines and the Niagara Peninsula, northern Toronto. When I was at York University, Toronto stopped at Steeles. Now it kind of stops at Barrie, or Kevin's from Barrie, but it pretty much does. So this is one of the crazy ironies, is that our best land is being paved, right? And that's a global phenomenon. That's not just Canada. So it's part of this overall land management strategy. We have no strategy, right? We're ad hoc reacting versus proactively deciding how we use our lands. But okay. So farm costs are going up, extensification pressures are increasing, but farmers aren't making any money. What does that do in terms of land retirement? Oh, this is just, here's a map of the highly erodible lands just in the United States in red. The best lands lost to development, eastern US, California. Again, it's a chronic problem. So land management is a huge issue. So why does this open up opportunity for payment for ecosystem services? Because farmers they just desperately need stable income that's not volatile like crops. And if I showed you I think the average grain price is something like $40 an acre, based on those economic figures that I showed you. And the Alice farmers have calculated it takes about $200 an acre to break even per year, regardless of what crop you're growing. So they pay farmers $150 an acre to take every year to take their land out of production to put in permanent cover prairie. The $50 that they don't give, the farmer saves, and having to cultivate that bad land, they direct those savings to their better fields where they buy more boutique corn grain or whatever it might be, corn seed. So that's how that payment system works. But it depends on revenue streams. So they don't need a lot of money. If it's $40 an acre, if it's $100, if it's $200, that's relatively low compared to what governments subsidize agriculture right now. So there's a legacy for government support, but there's also an exploding corporate appetite for supporting sustainability. So one of the beauty of the things about working with Alice is they're not government. They get a lot of money from Canadian grocery industry, from Canadian banking industry, from Bruce Hydro, Unilever, a lot of the biggest companies. And you look at the websites of any of those companies, they all have sustainability objectives. Unilever is like, you open it up, it looks like they're an environmental consulting company. There's nothing about soap or Johnson & Johnson. It's all we got to save the world. And of course, you can get cynical about corporate greenwashing, but, so what are the numbers? So the world economy is worth $89 trillion. In 2017, there was $500 billion in direct climate costs. Like, that was the year that Barbados got walloped by hurricanes and so forth. So the gap between 89 trillion and 300 billion is still relatively small, but it's starting to be bad for business, climate change. Corporations are meant to alleviate risk for their investors, publicly traded corporations, for example. It's a huge risk for climate change. So every corporation on the planet with a sustainability document has got a 10-year plan, and all of them target climate. It's bad for our business if our energy costs go through the roof or our buildings get blown down in a storm. Like the Fit for Less gym in Guelph, which I'm still waiting for it to open. It's December now. They're saying, so there's two things here. One of them is there is a potential to create revenue streams that would be attractive to farmers. The second thing is the revenue streams could be created, whether it be through government or corporate things or whatever. You could also, our food costs don't include environmental sustainability at all. That 20 to 30% of nitrogen washing into the Gulf of Mexico, no one pays for that. It's not in your vegetable costs. And that's another thing that we need to discuss as a society, whether we want to start paying more for these costs that for now have been just free. So, to wrap up, so the redesign of agriculture seems like a necessity to go from the homogenized monoculture to more variable landscape design through things such as these prairie buffer strips. This is from in the Lake Huron watershed. This is actually January. It's getting warmer now, and this is intense biological activity from non-native pasture grasses that are sucking up nitrogen from snowmelt, right? So we have the capacity to start to think about how we redesign our landscape in a precise way. Good land, bad land, retirement, all of that cumulatively. That's the objective of the new farm landscape. And I talk about the pros and cons of these sorts of things, and it may seem like a daunting task, but I think it's valuable to go back and remember how modern industrialized agriculture developed. This is the McCormick Reaper. It was arguably the first mechanized seed collector that was developed. It was pulled by horses. The seed were gathered here. It was hugely wasteful. Seed fell out, but it was so much better than harvesting with the scythe and piling wheat up. It was a massive improvement. So we look back on that and laugh compared to, thank you, today's technology where this thing runs from space by a satellite, or we've made massive advancements over a century for industrialized agriculture. We've just started with farm redesign. I think we're going to need some time, just as there was time here, but it does seem an endeavor that's worth it. So anyways, thank you for your time.